Chapter 21 covers the topics of taxonomy, phylogeny, and systematics. And these are all fields of biology that sort of overlap and work together to give us an idea of the evolutionary relationships and the classification of living organisms. A lot of what we're going to do in Chapter 21 is actually going to be done in our lab, or two labs, where we are going to learn about how we build phylogenetic trees and how we interpret evolutionary relationships from them. But we do need to learn a little bit about what we do to categorize organisms and how we determine their evolutionary relationships and their relationships with other organisms in their environment. So taxonomy is going to be the science of classification. So within classification, we have describing, we have naming, we have categorizing, and we can use taxonomy or taxonomy tools to classify both living and non-living organisms. So you are probably familiar with the term extinct. Extinct means no longer living, as in none left on Earth. Extant, so almost a similar word, extant means currently living. So for example, Homo sapiens or humans are an extant species, whereas Homo neanderthalensis are going to be an extinct group of organisms. So an example of classifying might be looking at Homo sapiens and describing their physical characteristics, naming them, and classifying them into their domain, their genus, their species, etc. Another example we might look at is, let's take the lion, for example. We might classify the lion into the family, or one of our classification groups of Felidae, the feline family, and we might name it with its scientific name Panthera leo. So we're naming and describing this organism. Phylogeny is the study of the evolutionary relationship and the evolutionary history of a species or a group. Now, this is not necessarily looking at the relationship, the evolutionary relationship, as in how are they related to other organisms, but basically where they fit into evolutionary history, and that is tightly related to their relationships. But we're mostly looking at how this organism or this group of organisms came to be. So this is going to usually focus on descent from common ancestry, descent from organisms with similar characteristics, and in our labs we're going to be building phylogenetic trees to determine the evolutionary relationships of similarly related species. So if we're continuing our example of the lion, if we're doing phylogeny, we might show that lions and leopards share a recent common ancestor. And we might determine that they share a recent common ancestor more closely than either of them do with house cats. And so we can sort of understand their position in what we might call the tree of life, where the relationships among all these organisms. Systematics is a broader field that uses both taxonomy and phylogeny to help us, in a broad sense, organize and understand biological diversity and evolutionary relationships among broader groups of species. So we're going to start by talking about taxonomy. Mostly we're going to focus on our really big broad categories and our naming here. But as we get farther into the semester, we're going to learn a little bit more about each of these classifications and our hierarchical system. So the study of taxonomy uses a hierarchy of classification. And from the top down in our hierarchy, we get more and more specific traits, smaller groups of organisms that have those specific traits. So we're going to look at our different levels of taxonomic classifications. But just to give you another word on top of all of this, In biological taxonomy, a group at any level is called a taxon. So taxon is just the fancy term for saying any taxonomic group. So we might talk about all of the organisms in the eukaryote taxon. That would include all eukaryotes into one group. Or we might talk about all of the mammals in the mammalian taxon. That just means we're talking about the mammal group. So that's just a general term you might hear. The highest level, the highest taxonomic level is the domain. And you're probably familiar with these three big domains already, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. Bacteria are the oldest domain. The other two branches, the eukarya and the archaea, are not quite as old, although we're still talking billions of years here. Archaea and eukarya are considered more closely related to each other than they are to bacteria. In this image, I have the last universal common ancestor. This is a hypothetical organism that would have been a precursor to our prokaryotes, because we don't get our eukaryotes until way over here. Our bacteria and our archaea are going to be our single-celled organisms, and it is hypothesized that the last universal common ancestor was in fact a prokaryote, because our oldest organisms both have prokaryote characteristics. This relationship was determined by a man named Carl Woese. He worked at the University of Illinois in the 1970s. And he used ribosomal RNA sequences to distinguish between a variety of groups, including these three major domains, and then also looked at our bacterial relationships. He was a microbiologist, and he was looking at ribosomal RNA sequences among our bacteria to determine their evolutionary relationship based on genetic sequences. In this class, you will need to know this very simple phylogeny. You will need to understand the relationship. You will need to know who is more closely related to whom. You will need to know where that last universal common ancestor fits in this scenario. So our taxonomic hierarchy is a sequential hierarchy going from broader category to more specific categories. So the greatest number of organisms are going to be found at the higher level taxonomic classifications. And when we get all the way down to the bottom at the species level, we're going to get down to 1. So every species on Earth is placed into a taxonomic hierarchy as best we can all the way down to species. And the characteristics that define each of these levels in the hierarchy are going to depend on the type of organism. Bacteria are going to have specific characteristics, archaea have specific characteristics, and eukarya have specific characteristics. And then from there, each of those is broken down into a supergroup, not in this image, but a supergroup is a category that was fit in between domain and kingdom for our eukaryotic group. And then below that, we've got our kingdoms. You are familiar with the plant, animal, fungi kingdom, I'm sure. Kingdom is just one level lower than our supergroup. So it is just a little more specific. If you think about the differences from the three that you already know, plants, animals, fungi, you can probably list a variety of characteristics that fit them into those kingdoms. We're going to talk about supergroups a lot when we get to our protist lectures, and you will have to know the supergroups of protists. You don't have to know the supergroups for the bacteria and the archaea. But the reason we want you to know the supergroups for animals is that out of those supergroups, out of different supergroups, we get plants and we get animals and fungi out of one. So you need to know the evolutionary relationship between those kingdoms and how they fit into the eukaryotic world. You do need to know the order, domain, supergroup, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You do need to remember that. I have a fun little acronym for you. It does not include domain and supergroup, but that acronym is Kings Play Cards on Fat Green Stools. That's how I remember the letter order, KPCOFGS. Kings play cards on fat green stools. And then as you're going through it, you do need to know what they stand for. So you can't tell me the fat green stool order. You can't tell me that it is in the genus green. You do have to tell me what genus it is if I happen to ask that question. For now, all you need to know is the order. We will talk about some of these other classifications as we move through this semester. So each of these is going to include progressively fewer species. So for example, we have one single species down at the bottom. There might be 4 or 5 species grouped into a single genus, etc. This image here shows you the classification system for the gray wolf. So just using an example here, gray wolves happen to be one of my favorite animals, so I'm super happy that they are included here. I am never going to ask you to name the entire taxonomic classification for a single organism. However, there may be some specific examples whose supergroup or kingdom you might have to know. Or for example, I might ask you, say that a squirrel belongs to the Chordata phylum. What are the characteristics of the Chordata phylum? I might ask you something like that, but I won't ask you to tell me the gray wolf is in the eukaryotes, Opisthokonta, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, etc. But you do need to understand the order. And in our class, we're going to get all the way down to the class level, talking about characteristics for these organisms. And we'll talk about a couple organisms as examples, but we will get down to Mammalia, and you'll need to know the characteristics of those when we get to it in a couple of chapters. So all the way down at the bottom, we have a single species, the lupus species, and above that you can see there are 7 species within the Canis genus. So here we've got a hyena, a coyote, and a wolf. You probably recognize these as being similar organisms. There are a couple other species that fall in there in that group as well. And if you look at this closely, you can recognize that we're getting more and more and more similar features. So as we go down, we get more and more alike. So we get to mammals. We've lost all of the fish, all of the birds, all of the reptiles and amphibians, and now we've just got our mammals. After that, we've got the carnivores, and so on, until we get down to the most similar, and then our individual species. Taxonomy is important in naming an organism. The naming system that we use is called binomial nomenclature. So nomenclature is the fancy term for naming. So we name using a two-name binomial, two-name naming system. So every scientific name of a species has 2 names, the genus and what we call the species epithet. So if we look back at that phylogeny, we've got the genus, Canis, and the species, Lupus. So the scientific name would be Canis lupus for our gray wolf. Just some housekeeping things here. For example, with our Canis lupus, we always capitalize the genus. We never capitalize the species epithet. Both of them are italicized. When you write these names out on paper, like in a lab or something, you don't have to italicize them. But if you submit anything like extra credit, anything that is typed up, you should italicize. Now, these naming rules are not random. There are guidelines for putting organisms into their specific classification. And these guidelines, these names are recognized by international associations and governing bodies for taxonomy. So believe it or not, there are groups of people that regulate this. And the reason that it's regulated is just consistency. So we know that if we're talking about Canis lupus, you and I are talking about the same organism, that we don't have two named Canis lupus, or that we don't have one named Canis lupus when we're really talking about one that has another name as well. So it's just all about consistency. I won't ask you to remember too many of our species names. There are a few that you might become familiar with, but it will require that spelling, they're spelled correctly. So I do require correct spelling on anything that is written. So sometimes taxonomy has to change. For example, when I was in elementary school, I learned that there were several kingdoms: plants, animals, fungi, protists, and bacteria. So that's 5 kingdoms. So in my lifetime, we have added in the domain classification. We've separated our bacteria, air quotes bacteria, into 2 groups, the bacteria and archaea. And then we've got our eukaryotes. And then once we learned that some of these organisms may not be genetically related to each other as closely as to other organisms, we added in that supergroup category. So since I was, say, 8 or 9 years old, we have added in these different levels. And then on top of that, as we get new information, sometimes organisms are reclassified. So for example, giraffes used to be considered all a single species. There are 4 main types of giraffes. And as people studied them a little bit more closely, they realized that they are genetically distinct enough to consider them separate species. So we went from 1 giraffe species to 4 giraffe species after a 2016 publication analyzed DNA from a variety of giraffes.